This is my dad's story from about 35 years ago. I will tell it from his perspective exactly as it was told to me. I grew up on the outskirts of Portland, Oregon, and when I was younger, my friends and I went camping pretty often, as it was something that we could do and drink and have fun being underage. When I was about 18, my friends and I decided one weekend to go camping near a lake called Small Fry. It's not too far from Portland, but far enough to get away. It was a pretty last-minute plan, so we didn't bring much other than some blankets and a case of beer my older brother bought for us. After school on Friday, we headed out, and once we got out there, we found a cleared-out area that we could easily park our car in. At first, we made a small fire and drank a few beers, but we quickly got bored and decided that we would go out for a midnight swim. The area we parked in wasn't near an actual trail to the lake, but it was only about a half a mile away, and we knew what direction to go in. My 3 friends and I were pretty buzzed, as we were somewhat lightweights at that age. We decided to head out into the forest towards where the lake was. Now this was back in the 80s, so we didn't have cell phones with maps on them to double check. We trudged through the forest, completely sure that we were going the right way. I think it was about 15 minutes since we left the campsite, and suddenly the air around us changed. It was a warm, nearly summer night, and it was probably around 70 degrees. But as we kept walking, it felt like it was getting colder and colder. Suddenly I felt all the hairs on my body stick straight up, and the 4 of us all quickly turned around and ran back towards the campsite. We didn't talk. Not even a word muttered to each other about turning back around. I've never ran that fast in my life. As bad as it sounds, my mindset in that moment was just I couldn't be the slowest, as I didn't want it to be my life ending that night. I can't explain why, but at that exact moment, we were all in that fight or flight mode, and we decided to run for our lives. I remember feeling as if there was a presence behind me. Not even a person, but just something. Something that wanted to harm us. We bolted back to the car, quickly unlocked it, and we all hopped in and drove straight home. We left the fire burning at the campsite, and all the clothes and blankets we brought with us were left as well. The car ride home was completely silent. We got back to my house. My friends got in their cars and left, and we never talked about that night since. A few weeks later, it was finally summer. My family went on yearly camping trips with a few other families that were close to us. One night, as a group of about 20 of us were sitting by the fire telling stories and just talking about life in general, someone from one of the other families brought up a weird hiking story they had recently experienced. He explained that he and his wife, along with a few of their friends, decided to go hiking on a Saturday. When they arrived, they were surprised to see that no one else was out there. It was a known hiking spot, so they figured that it would be pretty busy on a Saturday. The group of them hiked up the trail, and they soon got to the top of a cliff that overlooked a lake. When they got to the top, he felt as if he had no voice. The group of them quickly turned around and began to hike back down, walking much faster than normal. They didn't talk. They all just apparently decided that they did not want to stay, not even to take in the view. They had brought lunches with them, and all talked about taking some pictures too. Instead, they all hurried down the trail, not talking to each other at all. They all just had this gut feeling that they had to get out of there. None of them spoke to each other on the way home, and no one brought it up since. I asked where this hike took place, never mentioning that I had a similar experience. The man said that this all took place on Small Fry Lake. That honestly scared the crap out of me, as I had just had that same experience. I did not want to say anything though, as my parents were visibly concerned, and I didn't want them trying to tell me that I couldn't go camping in that area again. This might not be the scariest story, but I'm curious to know if anyone else has been to this area and had a similar experience. When I was talking to this man and his wife, they both said that they had this gut feeling that they were living the last few seconds of their lives. The man said he started to see his life flashing before his eyes as he hurried down the hill. I don't know what's going on at that lake and what made us all feel that way, but there's definitely something not right about that place. I've never believed in the supernatural, but after this, I feel as though that is the only explanation. All I know is that I will never be going back there ever again. I grew up in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. My family moved up there when I was about 6 months old. I was originally born in a small town called Mount Clemens. It's the same town that Dean Cain from The Adventures of Lewis and Clark was born in. I suppose that's my biggest claim to fame. Michigan is quite a unique state, the way it's positioned on the northern border of the US and the southern border of Canada. Those of us that are born in Michigan usually stay here, and no one ever travels to my neck of the woods. There's no real way to just pass by, and we're landlocked by the Great Lakes, if that makes sense. With the exception of the large cities, the state is mostly covered by woodlands. I have a few strange experiences living in the Upper Peninsula, but none stranger than the one I'm about to tell. We lived on top of a hill, about a 30-minute drive to the nearest town. Our next-door neighbors were a good 10 miles away. It was quiet. Few, if any, vehicles ever came by the house. I developed a strange fear of vehicles coming up the hill. It seemed like you could hear them for miles. I mean, of course, there were others who lived on our road, but this wasn't a place for outsiders to take shortcuts. We didn't even have names for our roads. They were all designated by numbers. When I got older, I wasn't too excited or afraid when vehicles would pass by. During the day, I knew most of the cars and trucks that our distant neighbors drove. When night came, well, that was a different story. I could see the headlights cutting through my bedroom window and light up my walls like some kind of ominous paint. It's a hard feeling to describe, but in my young mind, I felt that no one had any business driving down such a remote road at any point after dark. At the time, I was about 13. The year was 1996. Our family, amazingly, had just acquired internet. Anyone that's in their mid to late 30s knows how insane this time was. For whatever reason, at this time, my dad installed a glass sliding door on the wall near where the computer was. The computer used to be the hub of our home at the time, unlike nowadays where every family member has their own computer, plus a billion other gadgets in their pocket. So having the sliding door open up to the scenery of the countryside from the computer desk was actually pretty nice. I appreciated it for about 2 days, before one of the strangest things I've ever seen occurred. I was up late on a Saturday night on the computer, like usual. In those days, I was probably messing around in the Yahoo chat rooms, or maybe playing Myst. Then I heard it. I mostly felt it at first. The low rumbling of a truck engine, creeping slowly down the main road. The truck passed by our house, and then stopped. The long-forgotten fear I mentioned earlier came roaring back like a freight train. Nothing good would come from a suspicious truck driving down our road at 1 o'clock in the morning. What I saw next has burned itself inside my head. I can still recall it as clear as day. The truck screeched to a stop. A man flung open the passenger side door and quickly hustled over to the driver's side. This was all taking place too far away for me to give a really good physical description, but I could tell the passenger was much larger than the driver. He wore some kind of puffy vest, jeans, and one of those trucker-style caps. He grabbed the driver and dragged him out of the truck, then slammed him against the tailgate. He seemed to be shouting orders at the driver, motioning him to open the tailgate. When he did, I saw the driver turn to the bigger guy, as if he was hesitating out of fear. Even at a distance, I could see this clearly. The driver was unnerved, and his partner forcefully handed him a shovel. The passenger then pointed to a spot on the side of the road behind the truck. The panicked driver began to frantically dig where the passenger had pointed to. He dug for about 3 to 4 minutes, paused, then looked at the driver, and the two exchanged some words that I couldn't quite make out. The passenger then dragged something out of the bed of the truck. I can only describe it as a closed sleeping bag, with a body still inside. The passenger walked over to the shallow grave and tossed it in. The two men then made a poor attempt of covering the hole before they sped off. You may be asking, well, did you go out and see what they buried? And the answer is surely what you would expect. Of course I did. And that's the creepiest part of all. When I went out to the road the next morning, the hole was empty. I knew what I saw. There was even the tire tracks from the night before. But whatever they threw into that hole was gone. I looked to the opposite side of the burial and was horrified to see footprints in the dirt leading straight into the forest. I had no idea what to make of it. I've repressed this memory for so long and just wanted to pretend that it never happened. Aside from a few close friends, I've never told anyone about this. I believe that bag they threw into the ground had someone in it, and they thought that person was dead. However, based on what I saw the next morning, they were wrong. You can chalk this all up to teenage imagination if you like, but I stand by what I say. There are some things in this world that you'll never be able to explain, and even if you could, chances are you wouldn't care much for the answer. My dad owned a small house for a brief amount of time. This particular house was not one that he lived in. He bought the place to renovate and resell it for profit. This house was on a dead-end street in the woods. It was a very private location, but the road had a history of people dumping things off and abandoning stolen vehicles. There was only 2 houses on the street. This house was often used by drifters. A neighbor told us that it was a drug house for a long time. A few months after my dad bought the house, he called me to ask if I would meet him there to help him unload some materials. I arrived about 10 minutes before he did, and noticed that there was a car in front of the house. I decided to go investigate to see if there was anyone in the car. The car had a license plate on it, and I saw clothing piled up in the back seat. As I was walking around the car, I started to have this uneasy feeling that I wasn't alone. I then heard someone moving around in the woods near the house. I went and stood at the edge of the woods for several minutes, watching and waiting. My dad arrived a few minutes later with his trailer. He got out of his truck and walked over to the car. I told him I had a feeling that whoever owned it was still close by, and that I heard someone walking around in the woods before he got there. He looked over to the car, just like I did. Then we both decided to walk through the woods to see if we can find someone. As we were walking, I got the feeling that we were being watched by someone. I remember telling my dad how creepy it would be if we actually found a dead body. He said that he had the same strange feeling that we weren't alone. The pathway we were on came to a dead end, so we turned back. The car was still there when we returned. We decided to call the police to report the abandoned car. After getting off the phone with the police, we went inside the house to check on a few things. We were only inside for a couple of minutes. When we came back out, we noticed that the car was gone. Someone had to have been watching us while we were investigating, and decided to immediately take off when we went inside. The police never showed up that night, and we eventually left. Several weeks later, a dead body was discovered in the forest by the house. The person who found the body was a lady who was hiking through the area. There was a neighbor who told her about the body before she found it, but the neighbor had a reputation of being a mentally unstable drunk, and no one took him seriously. That was the rumor anyway. After the body was found, the police came out to do a report. One of the detectives took a statement from my dad. My dad said the detective acted strange and uninterested. I refused to believe that it was just a coincidence that we saw a parked car in that area, not long before that body was discovered. As far as my dad knows, they never followed up with the neighbor after the body was found. He had a conversation with him months after this happened, right before he sold off the house. The story gets even stranger. The hiker who found the corpse stated it looked like it hadn't been there for very long. meaning that it wasn't a rotting heap. She also noted that the head and hands had been removed. The police would later report that the body had been there for years. Something tells me that that isn't true. If the body had really been there for years, it would have been nothing but a pile of bones and rot. It just doesn't add up. It also makes me wonder what could have happened to me or my dad if we had found the driver of the car that day. This happened 2 years ago, and it still puts me on edge thinking about it. My husband, myself, and our then 2-year-old daughter moved to Tennessee to get a fresh start on life. We were all exhausted after a long drive and just wanted to get out the mattresses. My parents, who lived in Tennessee already, were helping us unload. Naturally, all the neighbors in our apartment complex came out and said hi. That's when we met Ben. Right away, I got creepy vibes off of him. Our daughter, who to this day is way too friendly to strangers, hid behind my husband and visibly cringed. We made small talk, but mainly paid more attention to unloading our stuff than chatting with our new neighbors. My dad later told me that at one point, he came back to the truck and saw Ben staring at our daughter. My dad called him out, and when Ben denied it, my husband eventually told him to go fuck off. Later that night, me and my husband were still going through our stuff. Our daughter was staying the night at my parents' house. It was about 10:30 p.m. when we heard a knock at the door. Thinking that it was the pizza that I ordered, my husband opened the door, and there stood Ben. He asked us if we needed any help. Him showing up at our door so late at night, even for a friendly neighbor, was just creepy. Before we could tell him to get lost, he demanded a cigarette. Not only was he a total weirdo, but now he was just being plain rude. Neither of us smoked, and when we told him, he got a bit pissed. He started yelling and screaming at my husband, and began pounding on the wall. This guy was unhinged. Thankfully, our landlord lived across the way from us at the time, and came out to tell him off. As Ben sauntered away, our landlord explained to us that Ben is the resident pest, and suffered from mental issues, but overall, was harmless as long as he took his meds. Yeah, because that's exactly what you want to hear on your first night in a new place. After that, life kind of fell into place, and we settled in without any further disruptions. We had crazy schedules and would sometimes work graveyard shifts. I would get home around midnight and would see Ben standing outside the apartment buildings. He would always seem to be staring at me. I would just ignore him, mainly because I was just too tired and wanted to get to bed. He would always ask me for cigarettes, and I kept telling him that I didn't smoke. My husband said that he did the same thing to him. We would change up our work times just to throw Ben off a little, and at first, it worked, but Ben started to pester us during the day. On our days off, we would take our kid to the park or the mountains. One time, Ben asked to come with us, said that he was great with kids, and that we could trust him alone with our daughter. I really should have just let my husband deck him in the face right then and there. When we came back, he was sitting in our parking spot, said that he was making sure no one parked in it. He then tried to hug our daughter, and she screamed and clung on to me for dear life. I took her into the house while my husband finally snapped and really gave the guy an earful, telling him just to leave us the fuck alone. We told the landlord, but they played the whole mental issues card. And look, I get it. Mental illness is never fun to deal with, but he was constantly harassing and terrifying my daughter, and we have a duty to protect our family. It got to the point where my daughter didn't want to go outside because the bad man would be out there and stare at her. We threatened to cut our lease if something wasn't done about it. I began talking to my other neighbors, and everyone seemed to have the same type of experience. One of my neighbors told me that he and another neighbor saw Ben staring at some of the young girls wearing bathing suits and short shorts by the community pool, and they chased him off. They reported this to the landlord, but nothing was ever done. After about a month, things had quieted down. Ben wasn't spotted outside anymore. In fact, no one really saw him. We figured he moved away or something. Good riddance. We were thinking about moving in with my folks, while we saved up the money for a real house. One night, I came home from work early. My husband was out of town because of work, and my parents had taken our daughter to visit some family. I decided to play Saints Row 4 and relax after working an 11-hour shift. I was deep into the game when someone knocked on the door. It was about 10 p.m. at this point. If anyone was coming over that late, they would have called or texted first. I got up to see who it was. Before I got to the door, the knob began to shake violently. Then I heard Ben screaming,
"Let me in! Open this goddamn door!"
The heavy knocking turned into him slamming his shoulder against the door. He was screaming like a deranged madman. I grabbed my phone, the sharpest knife that we had from the kitchen, and hid in the closet. Cliché, I know, but if he managed to get in, there would at least be some distance between us. I called 911, and they said that my other neighbors had called in as well. It was only after I heard the sirens stop and voices yelling outside that I felt safe to come out. I opened my door and saw a cop pinning Ben face down on the ground. The landlord was screaming at the cop to let him go, and he even shoved him. Both of them ended up being arrested. I gave my report, and each one of my neighbors backed up everything I said, and even added in their own experiences. My sweet church lady neighbor called my husband and parents to let them know what was going on, and she even let me stay with her and her family for the night. But after what happened, I couldn't sleep at all. I kept thinking that at any moment I would hear Ben's deranged screaming and pounding from outside. It turns out Ben was a registered sex offender. Rumor has it that the landlord was aware of it, but willingly overlooked it as Ben's family would slip him extra money as long as he was allowed to stay there. That's why nothing was ever done about his behavior. Makes me sick. Ben really did take meds, but had not been on any of them for the past few months. He tried to tell the cops that our daughter was his and that we kidnapped her, and that I was having an affair with him. Crazy, right? Last thing I heard, Ben was placed in some institution. I'm not sure if it was prison or a psych ward. The landlord was fired and pretty much chased out of town. Good riddance. We were offered 3 months rent-free for our trouble, but that was ultimately our breaking point. We sold off most of our belongings and moved in with my parents. I'm happy to say that we have a house now, and our daughter is not afraid to go outside anymore. And yes, we checked all of our neighbors for red dots. My mother was 14 in 1986 when this happened. She lived in China at the time with her parents and younger brother. It was deep into winter when this occurred, and the temperature dropped into the negatives. Snow was falling in thick layers onto the ground. It was around 10 p.m. when my mother finished up her classes, and by then it was dark. Bear in mind, in China it's normal for young students to walk home alone without a parent or guardian. About 10 minutes after getting off the bus, she began walking through this old marketplace to get to her apartment. The marketplace was completely quiet and deserted at this time of night. There was also no lampposts around, so it was hard for my mom to properly see where she was going. But she had traveled this route several times before, so she was familiar and knew her way back home. My mother had this feeling that someone was lurking in the darkness of the marketplace. She tried to shrug it off, but the apprehension persisted. She continued to hear her feet crunching on the white snow. But suddenly, she stopped, and as she did, she could hear a second pair of feet crunching the snow behind her. My mom panicked, but she continued forward and pretended that she hadn't heard anything. She thought it might have been another student making their way back to their living quarters. This thought made sense, but it didn't stop her from walking faster. As she began to pick up her pace, the crunching snow behind her also began to speed up. My mother couldn't handle the fear any longer and started running, but the thick snow made it difficult for her to run away quickly. She also gave a quick look behind her. She was greeted by the silhouette of a tall man only a few meters away and closing in. The man did not appear to be wearing a coat, despite the freezing temperature. The lack of lampposts made it difficult for my mom to make out anything else. However, That's not what scared my mom the most. She was eventually chased into an area that was lit by a dim light mounted to the side of a merchant stall. When she looked back, she was able to see that her pursuer was carrying a large plank in his hand. Now petrified, she continued to run and refused to look back again. Suddenly, she saw the light of a lamppost that was situated on a small street. Luckily that night, there happened to be a young couple walking towards her. With her last ounce of energy, my mom ran to them and collapsed. My mom was in hysterics when they asked her what was wrong. She explained to them what happened, but by then, the stranger had vanished. The couple that she ran into was living in the same apartment block as her and was familiar with her father. They accompanied her back home, and they told my grandfather where they found her. After the couple left, my mom couldn't stop crying out of shock and fear. From then on, my grandfather would meet my mom at the bus stop where she got off at, and they would walk home together. My mom never found out who her assailant was, and thankfully, she never had another encounter with him again. In the summer of 2017, my boyfriend and I were visiting my family before my brother started middle school that August. My parents were watching TV in their room. I was working on some schoolwork, and my brother and boyfriend were playing a video game in the next room. They were gracious enough to keep the volume down so that I could concentrate on my essay. At around 8:30 p.m., I suddenly remembered that I needed to put some gas in my car. Finishing the last paragraph of my essay, I called my parents to let them know that I would be gone for a few minutes, but that I was coming straight back. The gas station was about 10 minutes from my house, so I would have been back in about 20 minutes or so. I grabbed my keys, kissed my boyfriend goodbye, and left without another word. After 10 minutes of driving, I arrived at the gas station and pulled up to the nearest pump. As I started pumping gas into my car, an old beat-up pickup truck appeared in the corner of my eye. I turned my head to look and noticed two dark figures just sitting there. I couldn't make out any distinguishing features, but they seemed to be talking while checking out the place. I brushed it off and finished filling my tank. Before I got back into my car, I decided to run into the building to grab some snacks for my boyfriend. I then walked inside and quickly picked out some items. Just as I was done making my purchase, two men wearing jeans with black hoodies burst into the store, guns drawn. Both of them appeared to be in their mid-20s and fairly built.
Everybody get on the ground!
The first man shouted. The cashier and everyone else in the store immediately obeyed his orders. There was a few panicked whispers until one of the men shouted at them to shut up. I felt my heart pick up its pace, and my blood ran cold. These men were about to rob this place, and possibly shoot up the customers or the cashier. I prayed silently to myself that no one would be killed or seriously injured. One of the men grabbed my hair.
You, stand,
he commanded. Fearing for my life, I did as he ordered. Almost immediately, I felt an arm snake around my wrist and take hold. I would have elbowed him, stomped his foot, or attempted to punch his face, but I was so paralyzed in fear to think or do anything. The worst part, I felt a gun aiming at the back of my head. I tried squirming away from the man's grip, but he just held me tighter and hissed at me. "Stay still, sweetheart, and no one gets hurt." The other man shouted at the cashier.
"Hand over the cash, or you're gonna be scraping this bitch's brains off the wall."
I had no connection with the cashier in any way, except for just being a customer at the store, but I could tell from the look in his eyes that he wanted to protect me in any way he could. He was an older guy, possibly in his 60s, with glasses on his face. I knew that he had no choice but to comply with their demands. He hastily unlocked the register. As he was handing over the cash, I felt the barrel of the gun press against the side of my head, and I nearly started to freak out. I restrained myself and just started to tear up a little. My throat burned from holding it back, all for the sake of keeping myself alive for as long as possible. Once every last dollar bill was in the man's hands, Sirens blared from outside. The man then stuffed the money into a backpack, then punched out the cashier. I was then thrown to the side, my stomach and arm hitting the edge of the counter before I fell onto the floor. As soon as the two men ran outside, they were surrounded by police. Within seconds, they were tackled to the ground and handcuffed. I was still catching my breath, but I was more concerned about the cashier. I pulled myself up and peeked over the counter. For the most part, he seemed okay, although I could see his right eye was turning black. His glasses laid broken on the floor. "Are you all right, sir?" I weakly asked him, my stomach still hurting. "I'm a little blind at the moment, but I'll be okay," he responded. "Is everyone all right?" a familiar voice asked. One of the cops, who was also very good friends with my father, had entered the store. "Just us two might need some attention," I said. The officer turned towards us. He immediately recognized me and asked if I was okay. The cashier and I told him everything, as other cops eventually came in and questioned the other customers. It turns out that a customer had sneaked into the bathroom and called 911 without the robbers noticing. Once the questioning had finished, I just couldn't hold it in anymore. I burst into tears, not because I was in pain, but because I had just endured the scariest moment of my life. I just wanted to get home and put an ice pack on my stomach. The cashier was rushed out of the store on a stretcher. "Do you need any medical attention?" the officer asked. I shook my head and cried, "I just want to go home." As I walked out of the store, I noticed a few cops investigating the truck I had seen earlier. And then it clicked in my head. That vehicle belonged to the two men. They had been scoping out the place, waiting for the right time to strike. And I was pretty sure that I was the first person they saw to use as bait. A police car followed me home that night. Eventually we came to my neighborhood. My mom rushed out of the house and embraced me in her arms. She kept asking me what happened, but I could hardly speak because I was crying so much. Once I was inside, my boyfriend saw me and wrapped me around his arms and held me until I calmed down. My dad's friend came in shortly after and explained what happened at the gas station. After the cops left, I was lying on the couch watching TV with an ice pack on my stomach. My brother came in and asked me what happened, but I knew that he had to go to bed soon, so I promised I would tell him in the morning. I was still pretty shaken up about what happened, and I didn't want to scare him. I then made a promise to myself that I would never go certain places at night ever again. A couple of years ago, there was reports of a woman being attacked in my area. This was shocking because my community had recently gotten rid of a bunch of drug dealers who operated in my neighborhood, and the gang activity connected to that had died down significantly. We were all looking forward to living in a clean, peaceful neighborhood for a while. No such luck. I lived in an apartment building and was about 17 at the time. The attack on the woman was brutal. She had been sexually assaulted and beaten unconscious. Over the next few months, this happened to at least a dozen other women. Not much details were released to the press. I'm guessing the victims were too frightened to speak publicly about their encounters. Luckily, they all survived. However, none of them were able to give an accurate description of the perpetrator, as the attacker would usually sneak up from behind, in the dark. All of them were attacked while they were walking home from work. This meant that the assailant most likely watched these women and became familiar with their routines before making his move. Everyone was on edge. You could even see it in the streets. Husbands and fathers would hurry their families indoors as soon as the sun started going down. Children were not allowed to play outside after dark, and it was winter at the time, so the sun went down rather early. As soon as it got dark, the streets were dead. One day, my grandmother came to visit us. My mother had come down with a bad case of the flu. My grandmother spent the day at our place, and I guess we all chatted for a bit too long. By the time she was ready to leave, it was completely dark outside, and it felt wrong to let my grandmother go out on her own. My mom obviously wasn't feeling well, so I, being the stupid brave teenager I was, said that I would walk with Grandma to the bus stop. I was 5'2", not the ideal bodyguard. But come on, would any of you let your grandma walk the streets alone with a serial rapist on the loose? We got to the station just fine, and I waved my grandma goodbye as her bus departed. There was a crowd of people who had gotten off the bus before my grandma boarded. After the bus was out of sight, I suddenly felt like I was being watched, and I turned around quickly. As I did, I looked straight at a dark figure who was standing under a lamppost that was just down the street from the bus stop. I froze, shocked. The recent attacks had been in the back of my mind all night, and here I was, practically by myself, staring down a dark, creepy figure that was standing under a streetlight. I suddenly broke into a run and caught up with the small crowd of people that had gotten off the bus. I ran through the crowd and sprinted home, looking behind me every 5 seconds. I was in hysterics by the time I reached my apartment building. Now, hear me out, guys. I know that nothing technically happened to me, but I was scared out of my wits. So I figured that I would call the non-emergency number for the police, just to let them know that there was a suspicious man standing outside the bus stop. Couldn't hurt, right? A while after I reported it, an officer called me back. I gave them my number when I made my initial report. They were really looking for this guy, so they made it a point to follow up on any possible leads. They got the man's full description by reversing the footage from the bus stop's security camera, and his appearance was an exact match to what one of the victims had described. A couple of days later, I learned from a local news report that they arrested someone in connection with the attacks. On the night before I saw him at the bus stop, he had apparently almost killed a female beat cop who was patrolling around an area where one of the attacks had taken place. He attacked her from behind and nearly beat her to death with a crowbar. Luckily, the lady survived. But I think that was one of the reasons why the police were so hell-bent on catching him. I've learned one more thing since his arrest. He had apparently been there at the bus stop to look out for more potential victims. Thank God I called the police that night on purely a hunch. I like to think that I contributed to the arrest of a very dangerous man. Hopefully he spends the rest of his days behind bars, where animals like him belong. This happened when I was 9 years old in 1987. I grew up in Townsend, Massachusetts. It's a medium-sized town on the New Hampshire border. My dad worked for a very well-known local plastics company, and my stepmom worked at the Congregational Church. I got dragged along with his wife to church every Sunday, whether I wanted to or not. The one saving grace of going to church with my dad's wife was the opportunity to go on the playground after Sunday school class and the standing offer of cake, which they had almost every Sunday. It was one Sunday in late November. I was dragged to church with my dad's wife. Afterwards, as usual, me and the rest of the kids from class poured into the churchyard to socialize and drop cake everywhere. Now, I don't really remember what prompted me to approach a girl named Abby. She was 2 years younger than me and a lot more popular. She was somebody that I barely knew and hardly ever spoke to. But still, something within me told me that I had to tell her something important. So I sought her out on the playground that morning. "Hey, Abby," I started, feeling driven by something I couldn't explain. "You have to grow your fingernails out, so if someone tries to hurt you, you can go right for their eyes." I was dead serious as I said this. She gave me a slightly confused look and said, "Okay, why?" I didn't have an answer to that, so I just kind of shrugged and told her, "Just do it, okay? Trust me." A week later, she, her younger brother, and their mom would be found dead, murdered by a neighborhood psychopath named Daniel LaPlante. He had broken into their home, shot and killed Abby's mother Priscilla, and then drowned Abby and her brother William. He managed to hide from the police for at least 2 days, eventually being captured a half-hour away in the town of Ayer. When he was arrested, the police noticed scratches around his eyes. I cried when I found out that she and her family had been brutally murdered. I finally understood why I had to warn her, but still could not explain how I knew. Regardless, I view it as a failure on my part. I remember being incredibly distraught about it, No 9-year-old should have that kind of burden or guilt. I feel awful about what happened to Abby and her family, and I wish I could have done more to save her life. It took me years to mentally accept what happened. Survivor's guilt is a hell of a thing, but I was just too young to fully understand. My best friend is a social media influencer. Nothing big time, but with a big enough following to get free shit, and has gotten 2 sponsored trips. She works a full-time job, but does the Instagram thing on the side mostly because of the perks. She's not big enough to make a living off this yet. Anyway, this was her first trip. A small boutique hotel from Miami contacted her through Instagram and offered her an all-expenses-paid trip to Miami for Memorial Weekend in 2018, in exchange for her to be in the hotel and take pictures and do a couple of stories. She was told that she could bring a female friend with her, and everything would be covered. This was her first time doing this, so at the time she really didn't know how it worked. They sent her a bogus contract for her to sign. It stated that she would be responsible for paying for her plane ticket to Miami, and that she would be reimbursed for it later. This was to prevent a no-show, meaning the influencer gets the ticket purchased by the hotel, and the influencer never shows up. It seemed reasonable. She invited me, instead of a female friend, because she was nervous about the whole thing. We figured it wouldn't be a big deal, and worst case scenario, they wouldn't want to pay for my plane ticket, and she said if that was the case she would just cover it for me. We were supposed to be picked up by the hotel at the airport, so the day comes and we arrive in Miami. There's a guy holding up a sign with her last name, and the sign had the hotel logo on it. We were greeted and escorted to a black SUV. Here's where things get weird. As soon as we get in the car, the driver is visibly upset. We thought he was talking to the guy who walked us over, but he was talking to my friend. He had a very thick accent and was wearing dark shades. He was telling my friend that she was not allowed to bring her boyfriend, referring to me, and said that it was supposed to be 2 girls. 2 girls. Hotel told me 2 girls. No 1 girl, 1 guy. 2 girls. He was demanding to see where the other girl was. We were speechless and confused. The guy who walked us to the car looked annoyed. He got in the passenger seat and started arguing with the driver in what sounded like Portuguese. He then turns back to us and asked us where the other girl was. My friend, who's very upset at this point, tells him that there is no other girl, and that she is the influencer from Instagram, and I was just a friend coming with her on the trip. The big guy in the passenger seat gets out, tosses our luggage out of the car, and says something like, "This is some fucking bullshit." He then gets back in the car and they take off. And that was it. We were in shock. Utter and complete shock. My friend immediately emails Melissa, who was the PR person she had been in contact with through email, but she got no response. We decided to take a cab and show up to the hotel. When we got there, that's when everything started to make sense. The hotel had been rebranded and had a completely different name. We showed them the Instagram account, and it was indeed the Instagram account of the old hotel, but not the new one. They claimed to never contact us. Whoever was in charge of the old Instagram account, or whoever got a hold of it, did. Mind you that this was a pretty well-known hotel, and the account had over 10,000 followers. It was real, but upon further inspection we realized that the posts and pictures were really old. My friend felt like an idiot, and ended up breaking down. We called the police and met up with a detective. They investigated who was running the account before, or who had access to it, and nothing ever happened. It's upsetting and scary to know that whoever wanted to abduct my friend, or any other girls by using this old hotel Instagram, knows who my friend is. That account has since been deleted, and we never heard anything from anyone ever again. But to think that my friend could have been kidnapped had she gone with another girl instead of me sends chills down my spine. I've never had the best of luck with guys. I appear to have poor taste when it comes to dating. After separating for good from my kid's father after 5 years, I was ready to just be myself. About 3 months of being a single mother, my neighbor approached me stating that a friend of his, Steve, would like to meet me. It didn't take long before he charmed his way into my life. The first 6 months were amazing, but he began to drink more and more, and each time he would get extremely agitated. He would start fights with random people, and even some of our friends. Slowly, our friends would stop coming around, knowing how Steve got when he drank. This, however, did not stop him from drinking. But now all the anger was aimed at me. It took roughly 6 to 8 months of buildup, from name-calling and shoving to punching and choking. Suddenly, this became a very abusive relationship. One time, I escaped out of the bathroom window. He later found me by beating up a friend of mine until he told him where I was. Steve began stripping all of my clothes off in a drunken rage while laughing at me and challenging me to go ahead and try to escape while I was naked. The last night of abuse was by far the worst. Before Steve started drinking that night, I told him that my son, 3 years old, was not feeling very well, and I was going to stay with him as he fell asleep. My plan was to spend the night with my son. At around 2:30 in the morning, I heard the bedroom door open. I lied there pretending to be asleep. Several seconds went by. I held my breath as tears began to form in my eyes. When I suddenly felt his hand on top of my head, he grabbed my hair and yanked me out of bed, whispering in my ear,
"I know you're avoiding me."
Once in the living room, he threw me on the floor, then accused me of trying to leave him and demanded to know why. Before I could answer, he angrily came to the conclusion that it was another man.
"I swear to God, if I catch you with another man, I'll kill you and him."
He was obviously more drunk than normal. He punched and kicked me a couple of times, and I fell to the floor. I started to crawl to my son's room, and he slowly came from behind me, asking,
"Where do you think you're going?"
He then walked in front of me, kneeled down, and said,
"You stay right there or I'm gonna hurt you real bad."
He then sat on the couch and watched me as I sobbed on the floor. After about 30 minutes, it appeared that he passed out on the couch. I decided that this was my chance to escape. I put on an oversized shirt, picked up my son, and slowly crept by him. He suddenly woke up and grabbed my leg and said,
"Where are you going?"
I stammered out that I was going into the kitchen with my son to get him a drink. He then angrily replied,
"Hurry up."
As soon as I entered the kitchen, I ran out of the front door with no pants on, no shoes, and no purse. I carried my son all the way to the police station, which was thankfully only a few blocks away. After hours, the way the police station is set up is that you go into a room and press a button and talk to someone on the intercom. I ran in and put my back to the wall and pushed the button behind me as I slowly slid down into a sitting position while holding on to my son, waiting for Steve to burst through the door at any second. I remembered thinking if I was going to be beaten, at least it would be on camera. On the speaker, I heard, "How can I help you?" All I could do was cry. I couldn't even get a word out of my mouth. I didn't know how to explain. 2 officers came out to assist me. A female officer took my son and got him some food, and I went with the male officer to make a report, and he gave me a blanket. After 15 minutes, I heard Steve screaming my name as they brought him down the hallway. I held my breath as if he knew I was behind the door. 30 minutes later, an officer came back with a sergeant. At first, I thought they were going to tell me to go back home and gather my belongings while Steve was being held in custody. Instead, they asked me more questions about his anger issues and if there had been any previous fights. I explained to them Steve's alcohol problem and how he had become increasingly more abusive. They then showed me a list in Steve's handwriting detailing how he would dismember my body in a good spot where I would be buried without being found. He also had possible dates written down, with past dates crossed out. I couldn't breathe when I read this, and by this point tears were streaming down my face. I looked at the cop and asked, "What does this mean?" He looked back at me and said, It means you're lucky. Steve was charged with attempted murder, kidnapping, and assault. I left back home to Arizona before the trial started, but gave a detailed statement before I left. Steve, of course, pled not guilty, but in the end, he received 2 years in prison. Just before I left for Arizona, I received a letter from Steve. It simply read,
"It's not over. You'll always be mine."
I'm a female, and I'm 27. At the time of this story, I was only 19. I was living in Littleton, which is a suburb of Denver. I lived and worked in the same block, working at a hair salon, and lived in an apartment that was across the street. I lived with 4 other people in a studio apartment. Yes, it was chaos. But I was young and dumb, and I worked so much that I was only ever there to sleep. While working at the salon, I met people from all walks of life. Most were nice and hardworking like myself. In the plaza where the salon was located, there happened to be an abundance of loiterers, homeless drunks mostly. There was a particular man who I would often see. He always smelled like booze, but was nice enough. He was quite the flirt, which was a bit uncomfortable for 19-year-old me. On several occasions, he asked me to come hang out and drink with him. I always declined, telling him that I had a boyfriend. For the life of me, I cannot remember this man's name, so for the sake of the story, I will call him Mark. One afternoon, after getting off work around 4, I began to make my way across the parking lot to the coffee shop. I ordered my drink and took it outside to sit and enjoy the sunny weather. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mark approaching me rapidly. A broad smile was on his face. He came up to me and asked me for a lighter. Begrudgingly, I obliged, passing it over. Mark lit up a cigarette and returned the lighter to me, as he not so gracefully brushes my arm. A disgusting chill ran up my spine. I pulled away and suddenly stood up, saying that it was time for me to go. Mark then begged me to come drink with him, and again, I refused. After that, I didn't see him for several weeks. It was a bliss, since he was always lurking around the plaza, waiting for some sorry soul to look his way. One night, I decided to go for a night stroll. I enjoy night walks around this time of year because of the weather. I would walk around downtown Littleton and loop back to my apartment complex. I was maybe 10 minutes away from my home when a figure appeared in the walkway ahead of me. I thought it was nothing at first, since a lot of people were out and about. But when I got a closer look, I could recognize that it was Mark. He was swaying this way and that on the sidewalk, nearly falling into the road. This is where I made my first mistake. I should have crossed the road or turned around. Instead, I decided to walk past him, hoping that he wouldn't recognize me in his intoxicated state. But unfortunately, he did. Mark got in my way and stopped, smiling that broad smile once again. I sighed, resigning to my fate of having to walk with him. I asked him how he had been, and if he was having a good day. He said he was, but it would be a whole lot better if he had someone to drink with. I said that I couldn't, because I had to work early the next morning. Unfortunately, he was unbothered and continued to beg, trying the drunk puppy dog eyes on me. I was slightly uneasy, but otherwise unmoved. Awkwardly laughing, I tried to edge my way around him, but he held out his arms, blocking my path. With a serious face, I demanded Mark move out of my way so I could return home. For some reason, this flipped a switch within him. Suddenly, he grabbed my arm, holding it tightly. I winced and I tried to shake him off, but Mark wouldn't let go. He took another step towards me and grabbed my other arm. Immediately, I knew it was going to bruise. The pain sent me into fight or flight, and I picked both. First, I shoved Mark as hard as I could into a bush that was behind him, and then I started sprinting down the sidewalk. I didn't stop until I burst through my apartment door. I dissolved into tears and fell on the floor. Alarmed, my roommates comforted me and started asking me questions about what happened. After I pulled my shit together, I told them what Mark did. By this time, my boyfriend was in the apartment and was furious upon hearing this. He stormed out of the apartment with a bat in his hand. Another roommate stayed with me. When my boyfriend returned, he said that he couldn't find him. We thought about calling the cops, but rejected the idea because we weren't exactly on the right side of the law ourselves. Marijuana wasn't legal yet in Colorado. So instead, I decided to buy some pepper spray and start carrying a knife on my person. It made me feel much safer. And I stopped going for walks after dark, unless my boyfriend went with me. Strangely, I never saw Mark again after that night, though I was completely okay with it. So wherever you may have gone, Mark, just leave me alone. Next time, I'll poke a hole in you. I'm writing this after a lot of contemplating whether I should or not. But I've decided that people should hear my story to be more aware. It's been 6 years since this happened, and as I'm writing this, I still get paranoid just thinking about it. I'm going to be pretty vague with the details. To this day, I'm still frightened. I'm a 23-year-old female, but at the time of this story I had just turned 17. I was working as a waitress. After a while of working at this restaurant, this guy was hired on as a cook. We'll call him John. John seemed pretty harmless at first. I was, and still am, a very nice person, and I try not to be rude to anyone unless they give me a reason to be. And even then, I try my best to avoid confrontation. Everyone at work was pretty friendly, and we would often joke around and prank each other. Eventually, John joined in on the work shenanigans. I should note, I never flirted or showed any romantic interest in this man, and when we joked around, it was always in a group. It was never just me and him alone. One night at work, after closing, I went outside to smoke, and John was out there as well. We started making small talk about work, and then we got on the subject of tickets and fines that we had to pay. I told him about a speeding ticket I had gotten a couple of weeks before, and I had no idea how I was going to pay for it, due to me not making enough with the hours I was working, and because I was still attending high school, I didn't have the time to work more hours. Now fast forward a few weeks. During this time we chatted and made small talk, but again I will say that I never flirted with him or showed any romantic interest. It was Valentine's Day. We were slammed with customers, and I was on the register trying to cash out a long line. That's when, out of the corner of my eye, I saw John just standing there, doing nothing but staring at me. Employees had to use the register to clock in and out, so naturally I thought he was clocking out, so I told him to give me a second, and I would let him slide in and clock out. Soon I finished up with the last customer, and motioned for John to step up and use the computer. All of a sudden, he hands me a giant box of chocolates and says, "Happy Valentine's." He then clocks out and leaves. I just stood there in confusion. Earlier that night, I had been bitching to a friend of mine about how my boyfriend wouldn't even give me a card for the holiday. And now I'm just standing here with a large box of chocolates. What just happened? Why did he get me something? Did he overhear my conversation from earlier and felt bad for me? Or did he really have a thing for me? Very soon, I would have the answer to that question. I brushed off the incident, and after that night, I didn't see him again for about a week, due to him working the morning shift and me working the evening shift. One day I had to go to work right after school, and I decided just to do my hair and makeup in my car in the parking lot, right before I went in. As I'm finishing up, I saw a car pull in next to mine. Soon after, I heard someone shouting my name. I look over, and guess who? It was John. He looked excited and told me to come over. I got out of my car and made my way over to the passenger side. With the window down, I asked, "Hey John, what's up?" He then told me to get in. So what did the stupid teenage girl do? She got in the 30-year-old's car. I sat there nervously, palms sweating, heart racing. He pulled out a rose. It was one of those artificial ones that you find at gas stations. And then he pulled out a wad of cash. It was like one of those drug deal scenes you see in movies. He shoved the wad into my hand and told me that was for me. I just sat there with my mouth open. Feeling the money in my hand made it almost feel like I was holding something heavy. I struggled to find words, and it was even harder making the choice if I should take it or not. I mean, what teenager doesn't want a roll of cash? But I knew that if I took it, there would be strings attached. I felt like I sat there for an eternity, but it was only about 5 seconds, and then I asked him, "What's this for, John?" He then replied, "It's for your speeding ticket. I've been in a lot of trouble with the law before, and I don't want to see anything happen to you." The next thought that popped into my head was, what did I have to do for this money? And I didn't like the answer I came up with. I sat there for a few more moments, until morals and common sense took a firm hold of my mind. I laid the cash on his dash and said, "Look, I appreciate the offer. I really do, but I can't accept it. It's your money, and it's my screw-up, so I should pay for it." After that, I hopped out and went inside and clocked in. That night went pretty normal. Every so often, I would catch John giving me this sad look, and I sort of felt bad for him. I gave him the benefit of the doubt, thinking that maybe he was just lonely and needed a friend. So after that, we hung outside of work a few times. Looking back, I'm aware that this wasn't the smartest choice, being a 17-year-old girl hanging out with a 30-year-old. John was acting really odd outside of work, like a person that just gives you really bad vibes in the pit of your stomach. He would make a few passes at me, and I would politely excuse myself. Eventually, I stopped hanging out with him altogether. I sent him a short but nice text saying that I wasn't interested in a relationship. But apparently, he wasn't going to accept that. He would send me endless text messages, and would often call me trying to get me to hang out with him. Every time he was working the same shift I was, he would give me one of those gas station roses. I would cringe and accept it because, again, I was 17, and avoided confrontation at all costs. He was a 30-year-old man, and I was a teenage girl. I avoided him as much as possible. I even asked my boss for the working hours where John was off. Soon after, I started to ignore the texts. He eventually got fired for no call, no show. A month or two had passed, and I eventually quit myself. I had gotten a new number and switched phone companies. One night, as I was picking up my best friend from her boyfriend's, I was waiting in the car for her to come outside so we could go to my house. My phone then started to vibrate with multiple text message notifications. I picked up my phone and noticed that it was all from the same number. In total, there was 10 messages. I started to read and was so confused at first as to who was sending me their entire life story in a text so late at night. But as I started to gather the puzzle pieces, it suddenly clicked. It was John. I can't remember exactly what the messages said, but to sum it up, he was confessing his undying love for me, and didn't understand why I was ignoring him, and why I had changed my number. I was so nauseous, I felt my stomach churning inside me on the spot. How the hell did he get my new number? At this point, my best friend had hopped in the car, but I didn't look up from my phone screen. She must have noticed how uneasy I looked after I didn't answer her. She leaned over and saw the phone in my hand. She took it from me and read the texts out loud, and then suggested that I call my mom. I knew that my mom would be angry with me if she found out that a grown man was contacting me. So I told her that that wasn't a good idea. Right then, I got a call from a different number. I answered, "Hello?" And then I heard slow, deep breathing. And then the line suddenly went dead. My best friend, who we'll call V, said, "You should block that number." To which I did. But over the next month, I still got random texts and calls from different numbers. I would never text back and blocked every single one. Some of the calls I did answer, and I would hear that same disturbing breathing before hanging up. Eventually, everything stopped altogether, after I ignored them for so long. Fast forward about 6 months, and every single aspect of my life had changed. I moved out of my mom's place, and got my own little rundown apartment right before I turned 18. I had a new boyfriend, who I'll call James, who also moved in with me. I switched schools, changed my number again, and got a new car due to the transmission on my old one going bad. I also had a new job at a medical facility in housekeeping. There was a lot of changes that I went through. James and I didn't feel comfortable getting mail at our place, due to some of the shady people in our area, so we got everything sent to my mom's house. Every Monday I would swing by my mom's, do some laundry, and get my mail from the week before. So one day while I was over there, I had started some laundry and made myself comfortable on the couch, trying to enjoy my only day off from work that week. My mom walked in and tossed me my mail, and informed me that there was a written piece of mail addressed to me. This piqued my interest, because who writes letters anymore? So I skimmed through my mail, tossing the junk aside, and eventually found the letter that she had mentioned. It was a regular white envelope with my name on it. At this time, I had just turned 18, so once a year I would get birthday cards from a few out-of-state relatives, but over the years I learned to tell by the handwriting who it was, and I didn't recognize this handwriting at all. I looked at the return address, and to my surprise, it was the address of the restaurant I used to waitress at months prior. I thought to myself, maybe it was a check that I never picked up? But then again, I had gotten paid through direct deposit into a linked student account my mom set up for me, so that wouldn't make any sense. Maybe my old boss was trying to contact me? No, it couldn't be. He had my mom's number as an emergency contact, so if he needed to reach out to me, why wouldn't he just dial that number? I was dying of curiosity at this point, so I ripped open the letter, and as I read the first sentence, my blood ran cold, and I stood up straight off the couch as I felt a wave of panic run through my body. It was John. The letter was made up of 2 front and back pages. I felt so sick. How the hell did he get my mother's address? The letter stated that he missed me, loved me, and said that he hadn't felt this depressed since his mother died a few years back. He wrote that he wanted to be with me, and that he would give me whatever I wanted, a house, car, and even kids. This letter was a combination of desperate, delusional, and disturbing. I was only 18 years old. Did he honestly think that I wanted children? At the bottom of both of the pages, he left his contact info. But what scared me the most about this stupid little love letter is that there was no postage stamps. This guy had driven to my mom's house and put it directly in the mailbox himself. So now I'm standing there in tears, frozen in fear, as my mom walks up to me and asked me what was wrong. I didn't realize she was standing there the whole time, watching me read this letter, in fear that she would flip out if she knew the truth. I wiped my eyes and lied to her, and told her that it was an old friend from high school, informing me that another friend had passed. Thinking back on it now, it was pretty far-fetched, but she bought it, and I folded up the letter and shoved it in my pocket. I finished up my laundry and left. On my way home, I stopped at a gas station to fill up, and as I'm waiting for my car to be topped off, I pulled the letter out of my pocket and glanced over it one more time, before tearing it up into tiny pieces and throwing it into a trash can, hoping so desperately that that would be the end of it. During the drive home, I kept asking myself over and over, why me? Suddenly I realized that if he went through the trouble of dropping a handwritten letter off at my mom's house, what else was he capable of? I knew that somewhere deep in my gut, he was going to try and confront me if I didn't respond to that letter. I waited about a week to tell James, and when I did, he was extremely upset. First at John for pulling a stunt like this, and then at me for waiting so long to tell him. However, James came to the same conclusion that I did, and he bought me a baseball bat to keep in the trunk of my car and a bottle of mace to carry in my purse. Another 2 weeks went by. Things were pretty normal for the most part, so I pretty much forgot about John and the nerve-wracking situations that he would put me through, or at least I put the memories in the back of my mind. The weekday started off as normal. I woke up, got dressed, kissed James goodbye, and picked up some breakfast on my way to school, and attended classes as normal. Keep in mind that when John and I worked together, he was driving a blue car, so that was usually what I would keep an eye out for. I walked out of my school, got in my car, and pulled out of the parking lot. I was on my way to where I worked at the time. I had just hopped on the interstate, and went down one exit and got off. My grandfather lived near my work, and I did have some time to go see him before I started my shift, so I'm stopped at a traffic light, and I glanced into my rearview mirror and saw a red car behind me with a man driving who had sunglasses on and his sun visor pulled down. But I could tell that this man looked like John. I thought to myself I was just being paranoid because John drove a blue car. I continued with my drive, but I noticed that this red car was riding my ass the entire way, making every turn and switching lanes whenever I did. When I turned onto the back road that led to my grandfather's place and saw the red car following me, and I realized that this was in fact John, and it was at this point that I started to panic. I floored it, trying to get him off my tail, so I made up the quickest plan that I could think of. Pull into the driveway and run inside to my grandfather and tell him what was going on. I pulled in and stopped, but before I could jump out and run inside, John was already out of his car, walking up to mine and shouting my name. At this point, I was terrified and shaking. He gets to my car and pulls open the door, and is now blocking my path to the front door of the house. I looked up and saw the rage in his eyes. Everything happened so fast I can barely remember what was said. I do vaguely remember asking him why he was following me, and how did he know where to find me, assuming that he had followed me from my school, which meant that he sat in his car for God knows how long, waiting for me to get out. All he said in response was, "I need to talk to you." I refused, and told him that I was going to call the police. His response was, "I don't care. I just came here to see you." At this point, I bursted out of my car, taking John by surprise as I pushed past him. I flew up the steps and flung open the door and ran inside. I could have made the US Olympic team if they saw how fast I hauled ass. I was bawling my eyes out, scared out of my mind, shaking from adrenaline and shock. My grandfather was in the living room, asking me who was yelling outside, and the only words I could get out of my mouth was, "He followed me here." I turned around to see my great uncle standing there with a shotgun in his hand. He then followed my grandfather outside. My grandfather confronted John in his driveway. "You see that road, boy?" He pointed. "You best get your ass on it now." I was standing on the porch next to my uncle, who had his arm over my shoulder, trying to comfort me with a shotgun in his other hand. At that moment, I thanked God for my redneck family. John shot me this horrible look, as if to say, "This isn't over by a long shot," and then he sped off. My grandfather then told me that he was going to follow me home for the next few days. I also had coworkers walk with me to my car, and would have James greet me in the driveway every night. Fast forward about a month. By this point, paranoia was controlling my life. I couldn't go anywhere by myself. I deleted all my social media accounts, and would see a counselor at my school on a regular basis. I would even have the resource officer walk me to and from the parking lot. I was always looking over my shoulder with each step, and was still having coworkers walk me to my car every night. It's safe to assume that everybody at my work knew what was going on. After having off a Monday and returning to work on Tuesday as scheduled, I went outside to catch a quick smoke and joined the company of this older woman that I worked with. She was outside the smoking area, waiting for me with news that sent chills down my spine. Apparently, while I was off that Monday, a man came in looking for me. The staff knew that I was off and said they couldn't disclose any information about me. He told them okay and left. Fast forward to 3 a.m, and a coworker of mine who had a similar appearance to me, who was unaware that I was being stalked and harassed, had gotten off when she noticed someone in a red car was following her. It followed her all the way to her home, and this poor girl lived over 30 miles away in a different county with her mother and 3 kids. So when she pulled into the driveway and noticed that the car was still behind her, she called her mother and told her to grab her gun and come outside. Her mother did as she said and exited the house, gun drawn. My coworker stepped out of her car and tried to get a look at the driver, but was blinded by his headlights. I'm guessing that this is when John realized that the girl was not me and quickly drove out of there. After I heard this, I broke down crying and apologized over and over to that girl. I felt horrible. My problems were starting to affect other people. What if he had broken into her house, or worse? That thought scares me to this day. This was the last major incident with John. I actually did research on him a couple years later. However, I'm sad to say that it didn't turn out much. A lot of traffic tickets and a suspended driver's license. But other than that, nothing. Every so often I do try to keep tabs on him, because I refuse to be a victim again. I will say that he never threatened me, or physically harmed me in any way, but it's just the fact that he went to such great lengths to hunt me down, which in its own way is very unnerving. I have since moved again, gotten married, and very recently started a family, and I would say that I'm very happy that I've moved on with my life. But just the other night, after returning home from a long shift, I noticed one of those artificial roses, the kind that you find in gas stations, laying on my front doorstep. This happened to me about 4 years ago. I'm 23 now, so I was 19 at the time that this took place. I was up late one night playing video games as I usually did on the weekends. I remember very clearly that it was storming that night. It was a pretty bad one too. The wind outside had to be up to around 50 miles per hour, and the rain was coming down hard. I was worried about my power possibly going out, as it was a common occurrence whenever it stormed. After a few hours of playing my game, I began to get hungry, so I made my way into the kitchen to make a snack. I live in a mobile home community, so each home sits pretty close to each other. As I was making a sandwich, I heard a few popping sounds from outside. At first, I just assumed that it was thunder, but then I heard a couple of more pops. I looked out the window that was next to the back door, which was facing the direction I had heard the noises from. I really couldn't see much, other than the dim light emanating from a nearby lamppost that overlooked the street behind my house. Thinking that it was just the storm, I finished up in the kitchen and shut off all the lights and went back to my gaming. After about 10 minutes, I could have sworn that I heard a noise coming from my front door. I had a motion light that would go off at even the slightest movement anywhere near my front porch, so I looked out of my bedroom window and I could see the glare of light coming from my front porch. Having heard the noise and seeing the light now, I knew that someone or something had triggered it. I was home alone, and I was getting a bit creeped out. I made my way through the dark house into the front door. The door had a diamond-shaped window at the center of it, and I crouched down to keep myself from view. I slowly lifted my head and peeked out, but nothing was there. I opened the door and stepped out into the rainy night, and still I saw nothing. I went back inside and locked the door behind me. As I was making my way back to my room, I could see the flashing of red and blue lights from a cop car coming through the window on my back door. I went over to the door and saw at least 3 cop cars sitting on the road. I wasn't sure what was going on, but I could see 2 officers talking to someone who lived in one of the mobile homes on that street. I watched for a while until I got bored and went back into my room. It wasn't until the next day that I saw on the news something that scared me to my very core. The noises that I heard the night before turned out to be gunshots. According to the police, it was a drug deal that had gone wrong. 2 men had been gunned down, killed execution style. One man was shot in the head, and the other was shot a few times in the chest while sitting down in a chair. The police had reason to believe that this was gang-related. One of the men were identified after a family member reported him missing. The other victim was the owner of the mobile home, who had set up a meeting with the drug dealers. Needless to say, things went south fast. I came forward to the police after having seen the news reports. I am completely convinced that what I heard on my porch that night was the man who had just killed those 2 men trying to get into my home, as the police recall very soon after the shots were heard. I told the police this, and they also agreed that the killer was seeking a place to hide, and just happened to choose my home as there was no car outside, and he may have thought nobody was there. But once he heard me walking down the hall, he must have ran off into the night. I'm not sure what happened after this, or if the man was ever caught, because I never heard back from the police after giving my statement. It scares me to think what could have happened if that man chose to break open my door, or if I hadn't heard the noises coming from my porch. I very well could have been the next victim. I consider myself very lucky that I never encountered the killer that night. Always be safe. You never know who's out there in the dark.